Good morning. This is Monday Morning Motivation. Today we will continue looking at Micah chapter 6 and verse 8, and the third and final requirement God asks of his people. He tells us to walk humbly with our God. This is not to be in fear of him where we're expecting punishment or harm, but to walk respectfully and obediently before him. Walking humbly is a description of the attitude of your heart toward God. It is a life that is dependent upon God rather than yourself, your decisions, or your abilities. When we walk humbly with God, we don't take pride in what we have achieved or in how spiritual we have become. We recognize that we are nothing without God, and we totally depend on him for direction, for help, and for our Christian life. In Micah's day, the Israelites were guilty of treating God with disrespect. They were guilty of injustice, of unfairness, of taking bribes, of murder, of being merciless and oppressive to others. All the while, they were publicly carrying out their empty religious rituals and offering sacrifices. Much like the world today, they were guilty of having a form of godliness, but through their lifestyle, denying the very God who demanded righteousness, justice, mercy, and humility. Psalm 50, verse 17 to 20, and then in verse 21 can be seen as an example of what Israel was guilty of. God declared, "You hate my instruction and cast my words behind you. When you see a thief, you join with him. You throw in your lot with adulterers. You use your mouth for evil and harness your tongue to deceit. You sit and testify against your brother, and you slander your own mother's son." And then God shows if that was not bad enough, here's how they truly failed and piled up their sins even higher. In verse 21, God says, "When you did these things and I kept silent, you thought I was exactly like you." This was the opposite of walking humbly with God. We must remember that God sees everything. There's absolutely nothing hidden from his sight. And if we so live our lives where we are constantly mindful of his presence with us, then we will be careful of what we do and say, and we will truly walk humbly with him every day. Most of us may be familiar with the old Sunday school song, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little tongue, what you speak. Oh, be careful, little ears, what you hear. Little feet, where you go. Little hands, what you do." Why? Because there's a Father up above, looking down in tender love. This is how we walk humbly with our God. We remember that God is almighty and that he's a consuming fire. And even though we are made in his image and likeness, and he loves us with an everlasting love, we don't do as we like, but we live in such a way as to please him in everything we do. You see, when we view God correctly, recognizing that he is absolutely holy and absolutely powerful, it then forces us to view ourselves aright. It is then in awe we can prayerfully echo the words of David in Psalm 8. "When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him?" And in humble adoration, because of the incomprehensible reality of how this great and mighty God sees us, we are compelled to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with him. Then, when we view ourselves correctly, we cannot help but give to others what we have so freely received ourselves. And let me be clear, walking humbly with God does not mean we think poorly of ourselves. Nothing could be further from the truth. For as believers, we are God's masterpiece, created anew in Christ Jesus, according to Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 10. C.S. Lewis wrote, "True humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less." Did you catch that? Let me say it again. True humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. So we have the right view of who we are in Christ, but we don't let that puff us up or make us think that we are better than others or more deserving than anybody else. If you do this, then you will be falling into the same error as the religious leaders in Jesus' day. Our comparison isn't with other people because they are frail and prone to failure as we are, but rather our measurement is against the Most Holy One, and this causes us to always remain humble, because if we're completely honest with ourselves, we would know just how much we fall short of His standards. So we remain humble. We don't think and walk with eyes downcast and not wanting to even look up to heaven like the tax collector in the parable Jesus spoke of in Luke chapter 18. For Christ has brought us into a glorious relationship with God, and we can rejoice in this. But we don't become proud like the Pharisee either, boastful and commending ourselves before God. Oh no. We acknowledge and understand that there's nothing at all we have done to save ourselves, but it is simply because of His grace. And so we remain humble, and we walk humbly with God and before all men. My prayer for you as you go through this week is that you will walk humbly with God, acknowledging His goodness and His greatness every day, acting justly and loving mercy in everything you do and say. May others not only see the transformation in you, but may they also be drawn to Christ because of your changed life. I also pray that you will have a correct view of God, and out of that, you will have the right view of who He says you are in Christ. So be abundantly blessed this week. And then join me again next Monday as I wrap up this devotional on Micah chapter 6 and verse 8. Have yourselves a wonderful week.